Thank you very much. Hello?
Yeah, it is.
It is. My name is Paul Raymond. I'm a freelance journalist. I wanted to ask you, I've interviewed a number of Syrian refugees and refugees from other places, and one reason that Syrian refugees consistently told me for their destination country, why would you choose, for example, Germany or England? They were very keen on the German sort of the support that they would get in integrating and getting language lessons and so on. The reason many of them wanted to come to England or to Britain was because they already speak English, and they wouldn't have to spend 2 years learning Swedish before they could even start to look for a job or whatever. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering if you asked these guys, because I'm a Middle East, sort of spend most of my time hanging out there, so I'm interested in whether the same kind of dynamics. Do people particularly want to go to France because they already speak French?
Yeah, you know, I think that is. I think that it's a good point. I mean, one very critical thing, I won't enter into this debate very much, I'll let the others speak, but I will just say that it is the case that I must have spoken to literally hundreds of people doing that route over the years, and I've never found one who said, I want to come to the UK for benefits. They had no idea, obviously, no idea what benefits were, and then they find it, I mean, they think it's...
Yeah. Surgery, which is a debate that we are having in Spain right now.
And it's not dignified. They would also actually, well, we value our dignity, and that's about working and contributing. Right, so but we'll get a couple more on the same theme, and then we'll come to the panel. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Simon Cox. I work for the Open Society Justice Initiative. I'm the migration lawyer there, and it's kind of pleasing that there were no lawyers on the panel, given that, of course, it's law that's central, in a sense, to the problem, right? I just wanted to make a couple of comments, if I may, and then ask a couple of questions. So first of all, I was very struck by that last point about how the similarities with an area where we work, which is Nepali labour migrants going to the Middle East, about how people are selling a dream and that you're garlanded when you leave and that you're going off, even though so many people fail to come back with the goodies that they think they're going to get because you're not perceived as having other options. So I suppose the first question is, why is the debate that we hear tonight so radically different from the debate that happened even in the European Parliament yesterday? How can we get across ideas like you've talked about, the war on drugs? How can we get across the idea that Frontex is making things worse, that Frontex's broad attack on smuggling means that they've professionalised the smuggling structure, they've picked off the little people and they've left it to organised crime? How can we talk about what counterproductive law enforcement does? Yes. And how responsible is, I mean, for example, in the UK, how can we create a civil society response in Europe that gives those politicians a new place to move to on migration policy so that they can turn their backs on the failed Home Office advice they get that what we need is more resources, more boats, more borders, more fences, and a different kind of migration policy that more people in the middle of European politics can all get around.
Okay,
because I think that's what we need now.
That's great. And so no, that's good. Alex, how do we change politicians' minds? I mean, what you said, I'm sure we all found very attractive, but convincing a politician of your arguments, how do we go about it?
I mean, if there's one positive thing that's happened over the last 10 days, I think it's that for the first time in a long time, refugees and migrant rights have been top of the news agenda and the media agenda. And to have our Prime Minister, the leader of the opposition, on television talking about these issues creates a space, and it creates an opportunity to reframe this debate if we equip those people with the right arguments to make. And I think the quality of the debate has evolved over that time. So the quality of the debate in the European Parliament yesterday, for a variety of reasons, was significantly higher than the ideas that were coming out of the Luxembourg meeting and the Brussels meeting the week before. So that gives us a degree of hope. But I think we need to form a coalition which brings together academic knowledge and evidence with people that work in the NGO sector, with the media, and with some sensible, thoughtful, courageous politicians. Because if we can give politicians arguments that enable them to simultaneously get elected and do things that help people, then we're in a good position. And I think there are arguments that can benefit everybody here. If we seriously address refugee issues collectively through international cooperation within and beyond the European Union, everybody benefits in terms of human rights, security, and the economic implications. If we get responsibility sharing and relocation right within Europe, Europe benefits. If we enable the public to see the circumstances under which refugees and migrants make a contribution to host economies and societies, everybody benefits. But I think we need to seize the opportunity that's been created over the last 10 days to draw together the people that are serious about exactly what you've so eloquently articulated and push that, so that rather than this disappearing off the agenda, being replaced by the next crisis, we can actually use this as an opportunity for reframing. But it needs people across diverse sectors, and the thing I think we're missing is powerful politicians in powerful places who can start to shift the debate at that level.
Thanks. Oh, yeah, Florence.
Yeah, I would add to that it is important to empower local actors, because oftentimes we see these politicians sitting in London, in Rome, in Paris, and looking at broad issues, and they're not necessarily able to tackle also in Brussels. But to showcase the examples of what mayors are doing in local communities is extremely important, because mayors are on the forefront, and I'm talking about European mayors, not talking about African mayors, are in the forefront in giving responses, and they have the best and also practices that don't work, and they're able probably to bring about some examples that could constitute a template, and probably showcasing a little bit more the positive image of what the engagement is at the national level, local levels. I think would be extremely powerful.
Okay, shall we take some more questions from the floor, sir?
Is it on? Yeah. All right. Thanks. Abel, a fresh graduate from Uppsala University, originally from Ethiopia. My question is on the responsibility of Europe when they allow migrants, when they decided to stop the Mare Nostrum. Do they have blood in their hands? Because thousands of people have died trying to reach Europe. Do they have to die? Thousands of people have to die for Europe to act. The other question that I have is at the role of the media. We've seen 30 Ethiopians have been persecuted or killed in Libya trying to reach Europe, and I haven't seen, none of you tried to mention that one here, and I haven't seen a lot of things on the media. But we've seen one American journalist been executed in Syria, another one British aid worker, but the media was trying to make a big deal out of this. One person, they have a value, but 30 Ethiopians have been killed. No one was interested, just a tiny article on the news, and then that's it. What do you think the role of the media should be, and then how do they value, if I may say, African lives, just like any other?
Okay. That was good. I get that. Is there anybody else with a question at a sort of similar kind of feel, a similar area? Shall we just answer that one now, Gonzalo? Do you want to answer that about the role of the media? I mean, it is very true that there's a feeding frenzy once every year when a big boat goes down, and then it vanishes again.
Well, yeah, I think that's very clear. I am less pessimistic, though, about the role of the media. I think that, I mean, the media follows that news. I completely agree with you that the value they attach to African lives is incomparable to the value they attach to whites' life, and I think all of that is true. No? But my own country, Spain, is an example of, we've gone through the worst crisis we've seen in our democracy in 40 years or in 30 years, in a huge economic crisis that we are having unemployment rates over 25%, 1 out of 3 children living in social exclusion or in poverty, and still we have not seen a xenophobic clash of the kind that we are seeing in countries that are far better off than we are, like in Germany or in the UK. No? And in my view, the media has played a substantive role in that regard. Our media, I mean, is not very sophisticated, but still within our range, within our league, I think that they have been extremely responsible. And up to this point, I must even say that all political parties have been responsible in that regard, in not increasing. This is changing a little bit lately, no? But one of the major problems that we have in this debate is the absence of proper data. For instance, when it comes to something as simple as a proper estimation of the number of irregular migrants living in our countries, it is impossible to find out how much. I mean, and I think that the media can play an important role in having a mature pedagogic debate on fiscal balances, on the net benefits of migration, things that are very simple, that are just based on evidence and rarely reach the audience that lives in many countries on the basis of myths. No?
Okay, shall we have some more questions over here? Yes, madam.
Thank you. Sheila Page. I wanted to ask you really to comment on Gonzalo's point about the unethical nature of not emphasizing the importance of migration, because I think this, rather than some of the things Kevin mentioned, to me has been the failure of us, of academics, of NGOs and so on. We are self-censoring. We all believe that there are economic benefits for migration. We all believe that refugees should be accepted. It is one of those things which we're not yet quite ready to say because we think somebody will immediately think we're being stupid, left-wing, etc. But we've made advances on things like, well, within our lifetime, abortion, rights of children, homosexuality. All of these things were unmentionable, and although we all had the right ideas, we couldn't say them. One thing that struck me very interestingly recently is that there was the appalling inclusion of controlling migration in the Labour manifesto. Of all of the points in the Labour manifesto, only one had equal number of people commenting to the Labour Party against and for it. There are people out there who actually agree with us. We won't be regarded as being totally beyond the realm of normal practice. In my own town, there was real difficulty in getting a white person nominated for one place because it is such a migrant area. In the end, we decided to be tolerant.
But and you're going to have to come to your question.
My point is why are we being so hesitant about not? I mean, yes, the politicians aren't responding to us, but one of the reasons they're not responding to us is we're not saying it.
May I say something very brief on this? Yeah. And I'm sorry, Marta, because I reckon that this I agree in part with you that maybe we fear to say what we think. But I honestly believe that many simply do not think that. I think that this is what Lamprecht called the sedentary prejudice of many NGOs. No, we take migration as a failure of development instead of an instrument of development. No, we want people where they were born, ideally living with their goats in the rural sector, where we picture them instead of taking things as they are, which is. And that to me is a very important. And then of course this extraordinary geographical fragmentation. The moment they cross the border, they are not our responsibility anymore. The moment they do not live in what we consider to be the developing world or in transition, it is not. Sorry, it's very
No, it's a good response. But we better have some more questions from the floor, sir. Yes.
Thank you. Maurice Wren, Chief Executive of the Refugee Council. Two things. One is I just wanted to echo what Lawrence was saying about the role of local communities and cities in particular in the UK. We're seeing some very interesting work being done, dialogue between local community groups, often faith-based, but not necessarily, not entirely, with local representatives, getting them to get in conversation with government about being a receiving place, yes, and welcoming that and seeing the regenerative qualities and for a whole bunch. But my question is more directed at Gonzalo and Alexander. If, as seems inevitable, over the course of the next 5, 10, 15 years, the refugee numbers coming into Europe have to rise substantially, it's thinking about how that is, what are the mechanisms that currently are in play for getting a fair proportional allocation across the whole of European Union member states, and whether that is those kind of conversations are happening at any stage or in any place in Europe at the moment.
Yes, madam. We'll come back to your answers in a minute. Yeah.
Bindu Isaac. I had a question similar to what Maurice raised, but more addressing the possibility of a global deal that Alexander spoke about. And we have two representatives from intergovernmental organizations. I wonder what comments you would have to make based on your engagement with member states on the issue of migration, about how ready are they to engage with an idea as radical as a global deal.
Okay, well, let's get them to answer that. And Gonzalo's in a very good position to do that. About the talks that are happening about burden sharing at the moment, and how optimistic you are that when things rise dramatically, which they will do over the next 10 to 15 years, that there are going to be mechanisms in place.
Yes, I mean, I think I'll answer at least partly that question through an example, and it was, I think you asked about why is it that certain asylum seekers or potential asylum seekers want to go to certain countries? I mean, a couple of months ago, in fact, with Maurice, I was in Calais, and we had discussions with people on the move from Eritrea, from Syria, who were living in the most appalling conditions in the woods, with very little food and water, and of course just waiting to cross irregularly into the UK, risking their lives, hiding in trucks. And when we asked, why did you not seek asylum in Italy? Why didn't you seek asylum in France, where you're now? Why do you want to go to the UK? Well, many said, because I have a very close relative in the UK, and many of those, in fact, living as regular, I mean, with a regular status. So there you have maybe somebody whose brother is here, living legally, and he or she is prepared to risk their lives to cross from Calais here because he or she doesn't have a legal way of coming here. Now that is simply, I mean, unreasonable.
But in terms of burden sharing.
Yes, and if, there is an instrument, of course, the Dublin III regulation, which is the legal instrument in the region for the allocation of responsibility for dealing with asylum seekers, has enough flexibility if there is the political will from the governments to allow those types of persons whom Maurice and I talked to come to places like the UK legally because of the family links or because of humanitarian reasons. So the legal regional instrument is there to allow many more persons, including, of course, those seeking international protection, to come legally and safely into the UK, into France. I mean, but that is not happening. That flexibility.
Exactly. It's not happening. If the mechanism's there, and yet it's not being used properly, whose fault is that, and how do we change it, Alex?
I mean, I think the current EU burden-sharing mechanisms, as they're called, are really not fit for purpose. They create a massive inequality within the European Union, where Dublin means the overwhelming responsibility is on the southern European countries. That creates resentment, it creates inequality, it's not functioning. There's a very small European refugee fund as part of that, which provides negligible, almost meaningless compensation to certain host states. I think to make this work, we've got to sort of go back to the drawing board and ask what an equitable responsibility sharing scheme within the European Union looks like. Of course, that's hard because people make choices about where they're going to live, and even if you allocate or relocate someone somewhere in Europe, Schengen, etc., means they will go largely where they choose to go. So I think underlying this, many of the ideas we've heard about how we reframe debates at local and national levels are very important for getting at better burden sharing. We need to make sure that European countries want to be seen to take refugees and asylum seekers. Sweden and Germany do a relatively good job relative to the rest of us in that. I think the Cities of Sanctuaries movement is a good example. We need cities to put up posters that say, refugees and asylum seekers, welcome here. The data points have been really important. In a piece of research that we've done in a very different context, Uganda, we've looked at the economic contributions that refugees make. And we've been able to show that given the right circumstances, when refugees are given the right to work and freedom of movement, they make an economic contribution. So, for instance, in Kampala, we've been able to show that 21% of refugees employ people. And of those they employ, 40% are nationals of the host country. If we could have similar data in Europe, we could begin to reframe that debate. So I think, to summarise, I don't think the current system is fit for purpose. I think that's partly because it's genuinely hard, but partly underlying it, it's a burden-shifting mechanism rather than a responsibility-sharing mechanism.
Okay, thank you for that. Just to prove that we are global, we've got a question here from somebody watching over the internet who's Anna Dodedska, a postgraduate research student at the University Carlos III of Madrid in Spain. If the total number of asylum applications is distributed proportionally to every country in the European Union, do you think that this might increase the tragic incidents happening right now? Lawrence? Well, she's saying increase. She's saying that it would be presumably meaning that it will encourage more people to come if they think people are being distributed and, you know, that we're dealing with it in a more sort of positive fashion as opposed to pushing them back.
Well, I'm a fond supporter of differentiating, but here I think it's a question of harmonizing the policies. And indeed, this is something that is lacking. Just to probably answer indirectly to this question, I don't know if any one of you had the opportunity to see the short documentary which is called On the Bride's Side, which it's a movie about these Syrian refugees who arrive in Europe, in Italy, illegally, and then they move up to Sweden. And there is one particular passage of that documentary where they interview the Syrian refugees and say, we passed through Turkey, and we couldn't access any European Union embassy, consulate to lodge our claim. I mean, it's as simple as that sometimes. How can we act quickly and enable these people who have serious concern about persecution and life, you know, to lodge their that would dismantle or considerably contribute to dismantle all these smuggling and trafficking rings.
Okay, have we got some more questions in the room? Let's just have a quick look around. Should we go? Yes, sir. As you're sitting next to the microphone anyway.
Hi, I'm Joshua Asperton from St. Mungo's Broadway. I currently work on the Horn of Africa Health Project, and we deal with refugees and asylum seekers, mostly from South Sudan, Eritrea, and Somalia. We deal with new refugees. We had somebody arrive from Calais yesterday, and we also deal with refugees that are settled in the epicenter of the Horn of Africa in the UK, which is Shepherd's Bush.
Is that right?
If you've ever been there, you'll understand why.
Okay.
And a lot of people, of course, came on the migration routes mentioned here. My question is to the panel is, can we learn from the refugee diaspora here in the UK, which is only a tube ride away? And a lot of them, in the centre where I work, they often do tell me about the route of migration, etc., etc. So in terms of the evidential base and learning from people that have been through this whole journey and they're actually in London.
Understood, and we'll bear that in mind. We'll come back to that. Is there anybody over here? Yes, madam, because you wanted to ask something right at the beginning, didn't you? So that's probably been resolved, that issue now.
Hello, my name's Hilary Kerr. I'm a volunteer at the Hackney Migrant Centre, but I'm not asking about that. I'm going to ask the representatives of the agencies here, do they think that they have done their utmost to convince the politicians, to work with the NGO sector to build on a campaign? Do you think that you have done your utmost to have prevented this? Because it seems to me you're talking and giving us evidence of situations, but you haven't given us evidence.
It's a really good question, that. So we'll get them to answer that. Have they put enough effort in? But we'll just listen to a couple of people over here. Either, the lady with the large, attractive earrings.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Helen Parker from ODI. So I'm not an expert in this subject. My understanding seems to be that there's the mixed flows incorporate both people from emergency situations who I'd say their options are very limited, and therefore the risk of death is not really a disincentive because they're already facing very high risk within their current situation. And then the economic migrants, such as the video you showed us from Ghana, where their risk is sort of more long-term poverty and deprivation, and so the incentive is therefore to migrate. I think it would seem that the latter group, there would be more potential to protect them in the shorter term from these risks because they don't face like such an imminent threat. So how is the Beyond Aid agenda sort of tackling those groups in areas like in the economic migrant areas?
Okay, and there's another lady over there who wanted, yes, the lady on the, oh, she hasn't got her hand up. I'm sorry, it's the gentleman here. You had your hand up, didn't you? Sorry.
Thank you. My name's Anthony. I'm a postgraduate student. The question's primarily, well, for the whole panel, but I'd particularly like to hear from Alexander and Gonzalo. It's about the global refugee regime in general and whether it's still fit for purpose. As we've seen, people come and migrate for a variety of reasons, whether these be poverty or socioeconomic deprivation or violence, not just individual persecution, which fits the refugee definition. So do we need to expand the label of refugee to incorporate these people who might be suffering the same human rights deprivations? And how viable is that in the general climate we have now of fortress Europe and mild xenophobia?
Okay. And probably a final one for this little round, yes.
Hi, my name is Hector, and I work at Notre Dame Refugee Center here in London. My question is, you seem to you bang on about persuading powerful figures that create our policies so that we can survive together in peace or at war. My question is, how do you, or what's your intent in regards to persuading the masses? Because we're the ones that make policy move.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, my point is, an example is just the white flight, for example, East London. All the Cockneys have all gone to Essex because of migration.
Okay, let's start answering some of those questions. So there's this sort of theme about whether we're doing, or whether you, I'm afraid, are all doing enough to persuade the people that matter, and whether the people that matters are, whether they're the politicians or actually, I mean, the people who are influential here, to a large extent, are the media. I mean, we're the people who put the message out. But let's start with Alex about, you know, are we doing enough? Are we speaking to the right people? You spoke very eloquently before, and it's in a very attractive fashion. It sounded as though it was all quite easy to resolve if people just listened. But, you know, are we doing enough to persuade the politicians? Are you?
I mean, it's a great question. I mean, as an academic, I'm in the luxurious position that I can say, I can attempt to speak truth to power based on research and evidence. Inevitably, the challenge academics face is we don't always get the evidence into the right hands, and that means we need to work with other people who are better at that and have the skills to do that. And that's the media, it's NGOs, it's organisations like ODI, but it's integrate a space where politicians are prepared to listen and take that on board and prioritise it. And I think if we're to do that, we've got to realise what the incentives are that underlie these strange creatures, Homo politicus. And I think they are inevitably partly values-driven, but they're partly electoral incentives-driven. I mean, they got to have their careers because they persuaded people to vote for them. And I think we can talk till we're blue in the face and say, we're right and we've got the data, but we've actually got to recognise the incentive mechanism that lies behind a politician and engage with that and make it very difficult for them to get elected in whatever constituency they're part of unless they argue on behalf of the truth, and we've got to give them the ammunition to do that. That's partly data, but it's partly coalitions within local constituencies and nationally that we make it their job to listen to.
I've got to tell you, just very briefly, I was at a party political conference a few years ago talking about migration, and there was a man who will remain nameless, but he was at the time Shadow Immigration Minister, and as the questions started coming in, he didn't answer anything. And I suddenly said, well, hang on a minute. You won't answer any of the questions because even though you're Shadow Immigration Minister, it's such a toxic issue, you're so afraid to even talk about it in actually friendly surroundings. He wouldn't talk about immigration. He just told a few anecdotes about what it was like when he was a student living abroad. I mean, phenomenal. So that unwillingness, lack of willingness from politicians to go out in the media, they know as soon as they mention the word immigration, because if they say anything wrong, not me, but I know some of my colleagues will take that clip and it'll be the top of the 10 o'clock news.
Can I have one small point that I found very interesting this week? I mean, Ed Miliband came out with a portrait of himself as part of his campaign this week, and what was fascinating about it was the photographs of his family. And a very strong point he made was, my father was a refugee coming to the UK. And what strikes me as a really unfathomable disconnect is that that's part of his personal narrative, and yet somehow not part of the public position and policy framework around these issues.
Yeah, good point. And Gonzalo, you will know whether or not, it's this thing again about whether agencies of the sort that you work for are really doing enough to try and persuade politicians of what the facts are on the ground and the way of resolving the issue.
Well, I mean, I think we need to do much more. This will be a continuous process.
What does that look like?
If I thought we had achieved that already, I would retire prematurely, which I want to.
What's it look like?
I think what is, you know, I think what is tragic is that sometimes it takes tragedy to change or adopt or begin to adopt policies that many, or maybe most of us here today have been advocating for, and very loudly. Let's take, and I think the gentleman in front of me talked about Mare Nostrum. When Mare Nostrum, which saved an enormous amount of lives, was discontinued, I mean, one of the reasons being that it was believed to attract refugees and economic migrants to try to cross the Mediterranean. I mean, so many of us protested and expressed our concern, and also said, your strategy won't work, because people are not taking the boats because they want to take the boats, but because they have no choice than to take the boats. And of course, it was unfortunately discontinued, Mare Nostrum. The facts showed that it didn't work, because since it was discontinued, just in the first 4 months of this year, I think it's 46,000 persons who have crossed the Mediterranean. So the figures are not only going down, it has not dissuaded people. No. In fact, it has increased. But politicians didn't act on the recommendations, on the process, and it took the tragedy of the past 10 days.
But Gonzalo, it was a fatuous argument, and we know it was a fatuous argument from the politicians. The idea that the incentive was there, and that because it was the rescue boats causing the problem, we all knew that that was a diabolical kind of suggestion, and yet somehow it won through. It won through. The public believed that.
And it took a tragedy for at least the policy to be semi-reversed, if not because.
But we can vote politicians in or out. I'm just wondering, would it also help if we could vote your positions in or out?
Oh, right. We're going to just finally, because the question. Well, they might want to talk about that in their little summing up in a minute. But there was one final question for Marta, which was just about the solutions, and whether there are different solutions really for economic migrants than there are for refugees in terms of stopping them from having a go.
Okay, let me phrase that in terms of this. I think Helen deserves a more direct answer, which is, have you all on that table done enough? The answer is no, again, is my second no in my answers today. We have not done enough in the sector, in the development sector. I believe strongly that we haven't looked at migration enough. And organizations like ODI and public intellectuals and academics haven't done enough because of some of the things that Sheila has mentioned, because there is an issue with the timidity, there is an issue with the risk, there is an issue with this perceived toxicity. My proposition is that I think we are beginning to change course, and some of the things that Alex suggests is where this could be different. I think this notion of a coalition is something that matters here. In a way, this is what we're also attempting to begin today. And some of it has to be about bringing together the refugees, the agenda around refugees and the thinking around that, and those who have the long term and think about economic migration on the other. Not because it requires the same, so I'm coming to the answer, not because they require the same solution, because I think, as Alex very clearly delineated, there is a solution that needs to be, that can be found around refugees in an urgent factions, and there are legislations. But what strikes me is that whatever way you look at it, motivations, I don't think is our job to decide who has most serious motivation than others. People's motivations are strong, and the evidence suggests they will come. So in a way, we can argue about the fact that at the moment there are, the numbers are higher on the refugee sides because of the conflicts. But if you look at the number of economic migrants coming from all over the world via flights from all over the world to these countries, the numbers, I'm sure, are very high too. So what strikes me is this compelling evidence around motivations and drivers, and we better get on with it rather than continue to talk about pull factors.
Right, we're going to have a very quick summary from everybody here, just what if there's anything they're going to take away from this debate. So we'll start with Lawrence.
Well, thank you. It was been very, very interesting, and I would say that if I have to take away something, is the compelling need to create more synergies and strengths among the several areas working on migration, being academics, civil society, international organization, and governments. This is absolutely important to have some kind of synergy and harmonization into that. It's a very, very difficult task. Why? Because migration is an area where there is a lot of entrenched position and jealousy about preserving sovereignty. Let me just mention one thing: Schengen. We are in Europe. We have different systems, and the UK is one of the examples. Switzerland is not part of Europe, but it had adhered to Schengen. So, bearing in mind that the solution is not round the corner, I mean, I'm very much with what Gonzalo said, that yes, we can do more as an international organization, and we'll continue to do more in discussing behind closed doors and publicly with governments on trying to find solutions for migration. But on the other hand, I'm less optimistic as if this tragedy will actually constitute a game changer. I think the process is still long, and we will continue to see more shipwrecks.
Yes, Gonzalo, some thoughts.
Yes, no, I think what is clear from the discussion today is the complexity of the issue that lies behind the people crossing the Mediterranean, and the fact that it's clear that the solution does not lie primarily in terms of control, and that there is a global responsibility, including, of course, an EU responsibility to tackle the problem from its root, trying to address the wars, trying to address the persecution, also doing a lot more to rescue people at sea, but also allowing many more people, including, of course, those needing international protection, to come to Europe via legal and safe channels. Because if you only focus on stopping those boats, but you don't allow those very same people that must move out of the region and come to Europe, and you don't give them an alternative, then they'll end up swimming. Because they will leave whatever happens.
Yeah, very good. Alex?
I think for me, one of the takeaways from the really tragic events of 10 days ago is that they create an opportunity. They create an opportunity for us to begin to reframe the debate. And that moment, albeit only a week long, when these issues were taken seriously at the highest levels of politics and by the media, is something that needs to continue. We need that momentum where these issues are debated openly, where people who care about these issues, and particularly the human rights dimensions of them, come together and try to reinforce a message at every level. And that those levels are at the highest levels of government, but they're at the most local levels, including cities, including local civil society across Europe. And I think if we can get it right at every level, from the local level through to recognizing this as part of a global responsibility for a global issue, we can start to have this debate be more values-driven and far less knee-jerk reaction, opportunistically driven by politicians responding to lowest common denominator media. So I think this is an opportunity and a space in which we can start to reframe the debate.
Thank you for that, Alex. And Marta, a final quick word from you.
Okay, so I laid out my 5 points plan, so we'll implement it. No, we'll take up Alex's proposition that what is needed now is the coalitions. And I think with this event, we have grabbed that moment of opportunity, or we tried to do that Alex just suggested was so important. And that was done very intentionally, with the intention to start to bring in the room and around the table some of these actors that have that can shift this debate. We'll continue to do work on refugees like we've done in the past for a humanitarian policy group, but we will also now much more intentionally bring it together in some of these broader debates around development and migration, and we will aim to revert the course where, because development as a sector has not done enough for migration, we will revert that.
Now, Kevin, do you want to say a few words as you started it, for just a neat symmetry? To be good to hear you again.
Well, I wanted to say a huge thank you to you and to all of the speakers. It's really a fantastic debate. I think it's one of the best debates that we've had here. And actually, I think the wonderful thing about it is just looking at the lineup on the panel and listening to you, that that we've got your amazingly moving documentaries, which will be showing over refreshments after. linked to the sort of analytical power of Alex is thinking on the regime and the sort of the understanding of the system and Marta's take on the development implications of this. And I've just got a few things that for me that I've learned from it. That one, you sometimes have to sort of reflect on what you do subconsciously. And I can't remember, Marta, if it was you or Gonzalo who said it, but we do have this knee-jerk instinct to treat migration as a symptom of a development problem and not as a development opportunity. And I think that's a sort of hidden aspect of a lot of development narrative. People urbanize because of rural poverty. People move country because their nation has failed. It's a failed state. And actually, I think the lesson from economic history is that this is a driver of more equitable globalization, growth and opportunity and innovation. And there's a job to be done in changing the narrative, and I think we do have a key role to play in that. And I think Sheila is absolutely right about being bolder. The other side to this debate aren't backward in coming forward with their views. And I think we should be far more robust in setting out the alternative, both through the narrative and I think also coming up with the propositions. Because there's nothing worse than saying, like, here's a terrible problem. It's not going to go away. And it's actually a terrible problem and it's not going to go away. Rather than having at the end of it, here's 5 things that you can do about it. And I think we have plenty of concrete ideas on the panel. I do think also we all have a role to play in challenging public misconceptions on this. I remember seeing shortly after the April the 19th tragedy, there was a headline in the Daily Mail. I don't actually read the Daily Mail, but I did. I just follow them, which was something like 500,000 migrants waiting in Libya to come to the EU. Now that is 0.1% of the. Even if it was true, it's 0.5% roughly of the European population. So what are we supposed to do? Is this this is the equivalent of the sort of Genghis Khan hordes waiting to sweep. But it's somehow that's almost become a mainstream part of a political debate. There's this huge problem out there that we can't deal with in the sort of constructive way that's being described here because it's just too big. Actually, it's not, and I just think we need to communicate that it's not that big and be bolder. And I was very struck that Marta made this point, and Alex and others as well, about building unusual coalitions, different types of coalitions. We all have our coalition comfort zones. And this is one of the comfort zones I think we need to get out of. And it was quite striking, actually, in the debate, if you remember, on the migrant quota numbers that was dreamed up by the government, where the most vociferous opposition to it actually first came from the CBI. Essentially saying, are you nuts? This is going to, we've got desperate shortages of skilled labour. This is going to undermine our investment strategies. It's going to undermine the economy. So, maybe we should be doing more. I mean, I don't know what the CBI equivalent on this type of issue would be. And I think, lastly, to just bear in mind that actually migration has huge upsides. If I look at ODI, we would be an immeasurably poorer place if we didn't have our economic migrants, many of whom are here in this room. So we should celebrate it and not treat it as a development problem. So I just wanted to really conclude by saying, Paul, thank you to you and to all of the panelists and Gonzalo who has gone. There are refreshments only 5 meters away. So I'll leave it if you want to wrap up.
Just before you go, there is one final thing. It's just you could actually sort of packing up and leaving. There's a clip here, and I can't say it's an uplifting clip, but it's it's very, very short, and it's just recently I was on the Eritrea Sudan border. And it just makes you realise when people say there are ways of resolving this and all the solutions that we've heard of, potential solutions, and then you see that this isn't just sort of young men coming to look for work. When you see how young some of these kids are who are trying to do it by themselves, so these are unaccompanied children trying to have a go, and they're not just coming across the border from Eritrea, they're going to do the whole journey because their parents have said, go on, we want you to do it. You're doing it on behalf of us. We don't want you here. You're doing it to go and get money in the end, but also to save your life. So I just thought I'd show you this clip because it makes you think about just how deeply ingrained the issue is and how long it will take to resolve, really.